This is Henrik Andersen. I'm a 55-year-old retired history teacher, and I've always considered myself a rational man. Skepticism ran in my blood. Never was I one to believe in ghosts, curses, or the supernatural nonsense that the elderly in our small village of Eastvale prattled on about. For most of my life, I dismissed their stories as relics of an ignorant past, whispers from a time when fear ruled over reason. At least, that's what I thought. But now, as I sit here, haunted by memories I cannot shake, I realize how wrong I was. What happened to me wasn't some silly ghost story told to frighten children. It was real. And now, I fear I've awakened something far worse than I ever could have imagined. Eastvale wasn't much to speak of, a sleepy village hidden away in a forgotten corner of the country, surrounded by endless stretches of woods. Tall, gnarled oaks stretched for miles, their branches twisted and knotted as if grappling with the very sky. Even during the brightest of days, those woods felt unnerving, like I was always being watched. At the very edge of that forest, isolated and suffocating under the weight of its history, stood Dead Oaks Manor. The manor was infamous. For as long as I could remember, the old mansion had been the source of countless rumors and ghost stories, passed down from generation to generation. People said it was cursed, an ancient evil lurking behind its rotting doors. Some spoke of long-dead residents who never left, of shadows that moved on their own, and of whispers carried on the wind. I never bought into it. A crumbling house, long abandoned, doesn't hold spirits, it holds nothing but dust. It began on a cold autumn evening. The chill in the air signaled the approach of winter, and the days were growing shorter. I had nothing to occupy my time that day, so I decided to finally tackle the clutter that had accumulated in my attic. I hadn't been up there in years. Most of what was stored had been inherited from the previous owner, long forgotten under layers of dust. I sorted through old boxes. I came across something peculiar. It was tucked away in the corner, almost hidden beneath a pile of old, moth-eaten clothes. At first glance, it seemed to be just an ordinary wooden board. But as I cleared away the dust, I saw the letters and numbers carved into its surface. That it was an Ouija board, ancient and worn, its edges chipped and splintered. I felt an odd twinge of unease the moment I touched it, like a jolt of cold seeping into my bones. I had no memory of ever seeing it before. It certainly wasn't something I would have kept, nor had it ever been a part of my belongings. That I should have left it there. I should have walked away. But curiosity has always been my downfall. I took the board downstairs, setting it on the kitchen table as if it were just another antique. But the air in the room had changed, thickening with a sense of dread I couldn't quite shake. That I sat down, lit a few candles, and stared at the board, feeling foolish. Ouija boards were nothing more than toys, parlor tricks to amuse teenagers on a stormy night. Yet, as the flickering candlelight danced across the old wood, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The house was silent, unnervingly so, as if the very walls were holding their breath. With a deep breath, I placed my fingers lightly on the planchette. "Is anyone here with me?" I asked, more to mock myself than anything else. Nothing happened. Of course, it didn't. I was alone in my kitchen, sitting in the dark, talking to a piece of wood. But just as I was about to pull my hands away, the planchette shifted. Slowly, deliberately, it slid across the board to form a word, "Hello." My heart stuttered. The planchette stopped on the letter O, and I stared at it, my fingers trembling. It had to be a coincidence, maybe my hands had moved it unconsciously. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I wasn't moving it. Something else was. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The planchette jerked forward, faster this time, tracing out the letters in a jagged, erratic motion. "I see you." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The room suddenly felt colder, the air heavy with something unseen, something wrong. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced around, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the shadows.
"What do you want?"
I asked, my voice trembling now. The planchette moved again, with such force that it nearly slipped from my fingers. It spelled out one word, over and over, faster and faster, until the letters blurred together. Home. 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 A gust of wind rattled at the windows, and for the briefest of moments, I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of Dead Oaks Manor. The wind outside seemed to carry voices with it, murmurs that twisted and mingled with the creaking of the old house. But I should have stopped. I should have thrown the board away and forgotten the whole thing. But instead, I did something I will regret for the rest of my life. I asked one final question. "What are you?" The planchette shot across the board, faster than ever, landing on the word that sent ice down my spine. It stopped moving, and I could read it clearly now. Dead Oaks. And I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers continued, growing louder as the hours ticked by, rising and falling with the wind outside. I told myself it was nothing, just the product of an overactive imagination, fueled by years of skepticism and one strange encounter with a piece of wood. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I woke to find the Ouija board still sitting on the kitchen table, untouched since the night before. The air in the house was heavy and oppressive, and every shadow seemed darker, more menacing. The planchette was still on the word Dead Oaks, as if it had been waiting for me to see it again. That I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. And then there were the whispers, soft, barely audible, but always there, just out of reach. By the time night fell, I was on edge, my nerves frayed. I knew what I had to do. I had to go to Dead Oaks Manor. It was insane, but the board had led me there for a reason. I needed to know why. Maybe if I confronted whatever was there, I could put an end to it. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my coat, and headed out into the night. The path to the manor was overgrown, barely visible under the pale light of the moon. The trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The wind howled through the woods, carrying with it those same whispers, faint, disembodied voices that seemed to be calling my name. As I approached the manor, my stomach was knotted with dread. The house was worse than I remembered. Its windows were shattered, its walls crumbling, and its roof sagged under the weight of decades of decay. The air around it felt wrong, thick with something unnatural. But what terrified me most was the silence. It was so unnaturally quiet that I could hear the thudding of my heart and the rasp of my breath. The whispers had stopped and I stood at the front gate, staring at the rotting structure before me, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had come this far, and I needed to know the truth. That I stepped through the gate, the hinges creaking loudly in the still night air. Point 4. The confrontation. The front door of the manor groaned as I pushed it open, revealing the darkness within. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The air was thick with dust and the scent of rot, and the floor creaked beneath my weight. That I moved through the house slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step felt like a descent into madness, the shadows shifting around me as if they were alive, watching, waiting. Then I saw it in the center of the grand, decaying living room. There it was, the Ouija board. But it wasn't mine. This one was older, its wood warped and splintered, the letters almost worn away with age. Surrounding it was a circle of dried, brittle leaves that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from it. The planchette moved on its own, jerking across the board in sharp, erratic movements. "Welcome home." The words sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me. They twisted around my thoughts, mixing with the echoes of my doubts, fears, and regrets. They were calling me. I backed away from the board, my breath coming in short gasps. This was all a mistake. I was just a history teacher, a man of facts and reason. I didn't belong here, caught between worlds, in a place where the dead seemed to linger. Then, amid the darkness, I felt a presence. It was unlike anything I had encountered before, a coldness that seeped into my bones, wrapping around me like a shroud. And then came a voice, distant yet painfully familiar, drifting through the heavy silence. The voice that echoed through the darkness struck me like a knife in the heart. It was Clara. I recognized it immediately, that familiar softness tainted with an edge of sorrow I had never heard before. Her words drifted in and out, almost drowned by the suffocating silence, and each syllable seemed to wrap around my bones like ice. I wanted to believe that I was hearing things, that my mind, addled by fear and exhaustion, was conjuring her voice out of thin air. But deep down, I knew better. The weight in her tone, the sadness that resonated from somewhere beyond the veil, felt real in a way that no memory ever could. I was drawn back to the Ouija board, unable to resist the compulsion to stare at the planchette, which now moved with a slow, deliberate intent. It traced out words that spoke of suffering, of spirits shackled to this place and unable to escape. Each new revelation seemed to tighten a noose around me, squeezing out whatever fragments of rationality I still clung to. This wasn't just a board, it was a conduit, a dark passageway that allowed the tormented souls to reach out from the other side, to claw at the living and feed on their grief. Clara's voice grew fainter with every breath I took, as though the manor itself was pulling her away from me, deeper into its grasp. Her warnings were fragmented, torn apart by the whispers that filled the room like a rising tide. She spoke of a trap, of souls ensnared and bound to the house, their torment feeding an ancient hunger that had festered here for generations. The Ouija board was more than just a means of communication, it was a tether, an anchor that kept the dead bound to this place, unable to move on. The realization struck me like a blow. I had made a terrible mistake by coming here. The air grew thick and suffocating as if the house were exhaling decades of accumulated misery all at once. The darkness that surrounded me seemed to pulse with a life of its own, encroaching closer with each revelation, as if emboldened by my despair. I could almost feel it pressing against my skin, seeping into my lungs with every breath. I tried to shake off the crushing weight, to retreat from the suffocating presence that seemed to pour from the very walls, but it was as though I was caught in a web spun from shadows and echoes of the past. The more I learned, the stronger the oppressive force around me grew, and I couldn't escape the sensation that the house itself was alive. It seemed to breathe with a slow, labored rhythm, the wood and stone groaning as though it bore the burden of countless spirits. The whispers crept into my ears, their soft murmurings merging with Clara's fading voice. I tried to block them out, to focus on her words, but it was like trying to hear a distant cry over the roar of a storm. Each moment that passed, I felt her slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it.vi. The darkness surged around me, pushing and pulling as though it was alive, and I found myself fighting not only for clarity but for sanity. The whispers clawed at my mind, weaving through my thoughts, seeking to drag me down into the depths of the despair that seemed to saturate every corner of the manor. The shadows seemed to stretch and grow, swirling around me with a maddening rhythm, as if trying to consume me completely. I could feel the cold grip of terror closing in, an icy fear that made each breath feel like an insurmountable task. In the midst of that chaos, a memory fought its way to the surface, a memory of Clara and the warmth that had filled our lives before tragedy had stolen her away. I could almost feel the gentle caress of autumn air on my face, hear the faint rustling of leaves as we sat together, sharing a quiet moment on a day that now felt like it belonged to another life. That memory became a beacon in the darkness, a fragile thread of light that I clung to with all my strength, even as the shadows surged and whispered, seeking to unravel it. That I focused on that memory, pushing back against the encroaching darkness with every ounce of will I possessed. For the briefest of moments, the suffocating pressure seemed to recede, as if the darkness itself had been scorched by the warmth of my recollections. The whispers faltered, their malevolence dimming as the light of that memory seeped into the room, pushing back against the relentless gloom. But I knew it wouldn't last. The darkness was more than just an absence of light, it was a living thing, older and hungrier than I could fathom, and it would not be so easily banished. The manor trembled as though it could sense my defiance, the very walls groaning in protest. The shadows that writhed around me grew frantic, their movements fevered and desperate, but I held firm, refusing to surrender to the fear that clawed at the edges of my mind. I took a step forward, then another, my gaze fixed on the far side of the room where the shadows seemed to converge, as though drawn to a source that lay just beyond my reach. That I felt a surge of strength that I hadn't known I possessed, a raw determination born from a mixture of grief and anger. The whispers redoubled their efforts, but I pressed on, driven by the distant echoes of Clara's voice and the light of that memory that still flickered in my heart. I was no longer simply trying to escape, I was fighting for the very essence of who I was, struggling against a force that sought to strip away everything I held dear. The house shook around me, and the oppressive darkness seemed to retreat, ever so slightly, but it was far from defeated. I stumbled through the gloom, guided by a strange intuition that seemed to draw me towards the back of the manor. There, behind a heavy, ancient door that pulsed faintly with energy, I found a room that felt different from the others. It wasn't just dark, it was suffocating, as though the shadows had substance, thickening the air with an oppressive weight that settled over my chest. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the room within, shrouded in an unsettling darkness that seemed to resist the beam of my flashlight that I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat as the dim light revealed what lay within. The room was filled with old furniture, their shapes draped in white sheets, giving them the appearance of ghostly figures frozen in time. Dust hung in the air, stirred only by my movements, and the silence was so deep it felt unnatural, as though the space itself had been forgotten by time. At the center of the room stood an altar, its surface cluttered with the remnants of what seemed like some dark ritual, melted candles twisted into grotesque shapes, animal bones arranged in intricate patterns, and symbols that had been carved deeply into the wood, their jagged edges pulsing with a faint luminescence. The altar seemed to radiate a sense of wrongness as if it was a focal point for the manor's darkness. I felt a chill seep into my bones as I approached it, my footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. As I drew closer, something on the altar caught my eye, a knife, old and tarnished, its blade dull from age but still bearing a faint sheen as if it had been used for purposes that I dared not imagine. That I picked up the knife, the weight of it settling into my hand. Its hilt was cold to the touch, as though it had been lying there for centuries, untouched by warmth. There was a strange sensation that passed through me the moment I grasped it, a mixture of dread and grim resolve. The knife seemed out of place, yet at the same time, it felt like it belonged there, as though it was part of the house's history, a tool that had seen more than its fair share of dark ceremonies. As I examined it more closely, I noticed faint etchings along the blade, symbols that resembled the ones carved into the altar. It felt as though the knife was imbued with some latent power, its cold metal thrumming faintly with a dark energy. Holding it, I had the unshakable feeling that this was no ordinary blade. It had been used for something terrible, perhaps even to bind the souls that were trapped within the manor. That I gripped the knife more tightly, my knuckles whitening. If there was a way to sever the connection that kept Clara and others bound to this place, this knife might be the key. I could feel the darkness around me reacting to the knife's presence, as though the shadows themselves recoiled from it. It was as if the blade held some power over the manor, something the spirits feared. But even as I steeled myself, the room seemed to close in around me, the air thickening once more. The photographs on the wall caught my eye again, their subjects' expressions frozen in time, faces twisted in anguish, or perhaps terror. Clara's photograph, in particular, seemed to glow faintly, her eyes fixed on me as though pleading for something I could not give. It stirred a desperate longing within me, an urge to finally understand the extent of what she had known, to rescue her from whatever darkness had ensnared her. A sudden, cold dread gripped my heart. What if this was what the manor wanted? What if the knife wasn't a tool for salvation, but rather a lure, something to draw me further into its web? The thought gnawed at me, casting doubts over my resolve. Yet, I couldn't walk away now, not after everything I had seen and felt. If there was a chance to free Clara, to sever the ties that bound her spirit here, I had to take it. The darkness around me thickened, swirling with a restless energy that seemed to emanate from the altar itself. It was as if the house was alive, its hunger growing with each passing moment, the whispers growing louder and more insistent, seeping into my thoughts like venom. The shadows that coiled at the edges of the room seemed to stretch and reach for me, as though they were desperate to reclaim something I had taken. Clutching the knife, I turned my gaze toward the altar, the shattered remnants of the Ouija board glinting faintly in the dim light. The planchette lay atop the fractured wood, and it felt as if it was waiting for me to make a choice, to act on the terrible knowledge that now weighed on my mind. The decision loomed before me, and with it, a terrible clarity. I would have to confront the darkness head-on. The knife plunged into the Ouija board with a force that seemed to split the very air. For a moment, the darkness recoiled, and a searing light flashed across the room. The house trembled as if it was alive, groaning under the strain, and I felt an immense weight lift, the air growing lighter. The whispers ceased, and for a breathless instant, it felt like I had finally broken the curse, but as quickly as the light had come, it faded, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and more unnerving than before. The shattered pieces of the board lay scattered at my feet, motionless. Yet, the room did not feel empty. It was as though the air was charged with something unseen, something that still lingered just out of reach. That I took a hesitant step back, my heart pounding in the quiet. The shadows no longer surged, but they hadn't truly disappeared either. They seemed to hover at the edges, a thin veil between me and whatever lay beyond. I could no longer tell where the darkness ended and the room began, as if the boundaries between this world and the next had somehow blurred. Turning towards the door, I felt an inexplicable pull, a sensation that urged me to look back. There, amid the fractured pieces of the board, the planchette lay untouched, but something else caught my eye. A faint glow flickered among the letters, dim and unsteady, as though the shattered wood was still alive with energy. It formed no discernible word, only scattered letters that hinted at something unfinished. That I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder. The silence pressed in, yet the air was filled with a strange expectancy, as if the house itself was waiting. Waiting for me to do something, or perhaps, for me to leave and take whatever I had awakened with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't severed the connection. I had merely opened a door, and it was up to me to decide whether to close it or walk through. That I forced myself to turn away and head for the front entrance, the weight of the air lifting slightly as I put distance between myself and the altar. The hallway seemed longer now, as though the manor was stretching itself, trying to keep me inside just a little longer. I walked faster, refusing to look back, refusing to acknowledge the creeping dread that followed me down the darkened corridors. I finally stepped outside into the cold night. I was met with the same unnerving stillness. The manor loomed behind me, its windows dark, yet I felt its presence as if it were watching. I took one last glance at the old house, the memory of the whispers echoing faintly in my mind. But as I turned to leave, a distant sound stopped me, a faint tapping, as though something, or someone, was gently rapping from within. That I walked away, my steps unsteady, a coldness settling deep in my bones. The night seemed too quiet, the wind barely stirring the leaves, and though I was leaving the manor behind, I couldn't shake the sense that a part of it had followed me. Or perhaps, I had brought something with me from inside. I quickened my pace, eager to put distance between myself and that place, but the feeling of being watched never quite left. Now, even back in the village, There are nights when I wake to the sound of faint whispers outside my window, or see the shadows in the corners of my room shift ever so slightly. I tell myself it's just the remnants of an old fear, the echo of a place I should have never entered, but deep down, I can't help but wonder if the door I opened that night ever truly closed.